Now that you've got a good basic animation, let's have a little fun with it. What I am going to do now is I'm going to start with my sphere selected. I'm going to add a deformer. The first deformers I want to show you are the nonlinear deformers because the nonlinear deformers are just fun. Under Deform, Nonlinear, there are a number of options, so I am going to click this double line area to pull them out, and that way you can see what they do. The one you are most likely to use in this exercise is the Squash Deformer, so I will add that first. These will only add to a selected object, so you do have to have something selected before you apply the deformer. The deformer comes in as a secondary object. I can see it here in my outliner. If this is specifically for your lighter ball, you might want to call this one Light Ball Squash Handle. The other thing that I want you to do is to take it and make it the child of the object it's going to deform so that they move together. And I'll show you why in just a moment. I made that parent-child relationship by middle mouse dragging the squash handle onto the ball. You can also select the squash handle first, shift select the ball, and press the P key on your keyboard. The squash handle itself has an input in the channel box called Squash 1. In Squash 1, there's a factor. The factor allows me to stretch or squash the ball for really cartoony effects. There are, of course, other attributes. There is expand. There is this max factor, which will allow me to kind of wait where the expansion is happening. A start and smoothness. A low bound and a high bound, and these will adjust where the stretch or the squash takes place, whether it covers the whole thing or not. There's also an envelope, and the envelope acts almost as a dampener. So if the envelope is set to 1, the entire sphere will be affected. If it's set below 1, the entire sphere will not be affected, less than the whole thing. With all of these, the fun part is, of course, that they are animatable. So I can take my bouncing ball. At the first frame, I am going to right-click and key selected on my factor. When the ball hits the ground at frame 12, it should probably squash a little bit. So I will just squash that. But now you see that the ball squashes its whole way down, and it shouldn't squash the whole way down, it should stretch on the way down. So maybe around frame 9 I will come in and just move that factor in the other direction so the ball is a little bit stretched. So now the ball will go from normal, through a stretch, down to a squash. The next place I want it to squash is going to be right around frame 24. And here I probably don't want it to squash as much because of course it didn't hit the ground quite as hard. But while it's up in the air, it should still be a little bit stretched. So I'll move it back up into the air and stretch it out. And then again, I will put in another squash right where the ball hits the ground. That looks like it's right around frame 32. I want that up just a tiny bit. Maybe I will key in -0.2. And then again, I will go back a few frames and stretch it out. Again, just a little bit. And then its last impact, let's move that to negative 0.1, and we'll give it a couple of frames to rebound back up to its full size. Maybe at frame 34 we will do just the tiniest bit of stretch. Tiniest, right there. So now my animation looks a lot more cartoony. Of course, with the squash handle, one thing that I have to be aware of is that the squash happens from the center of the sphere. So if I look at the ball, I can see that the ball is in fact no longer on the ground. So I have to take my translate Y's and move them down a little bit. I'm doing this with my middle mouse drag in the graph editor. And this is a great time for me to come over to my side orthographic view. Just move that down just a smidge so that I know that its feet line up with the grid. Then I'll come to frame 24 and do the same thing. 32, 36, and then because I do have the ball moving to frame 38, it will be worth it for me to zero this back out. And now let me go back to my perspective view and try this one more time. So I've done something terrible with this first frame. Let me move that back up. Nice and high. I think I had it right around 9. And that's much better. So I mentioned earlier that I want to be sure that the squash handle is the child of the object that it's going to deform. And the reason for that is that the squash handle is its own object. So I've come here to a place where you can really see what the squash handle is doing. And now I'm going to take the squash handle and I'm going to move it. And you can see that as I do so, the deformation kind of happens across the sphere. So by making the squash handle the child of the sphere, I can ensure that they stay together as they are animated, and I don't have to worry about the squash handle getting lost. I'm going to do a second video where I can show you briefly what the other nonlinear deformers do, just so that you can have some fun with them.